Welcome to the American Association of Critical Care Nurses Voices in Nursing podcast, exploring critical care nursing through meaningful and inspiring conversations. This episode is sponsored by AACN's Beacon Award for Excellence, offering unit-level recognition for exceptional units, with information available at www.aacn.org/unit recognition. Now, here are your hosts, AACN's Chief Clinical Officer, Vicki Good, and Clinical Practice Specialist, Andrea Schmidt.
Welcome to Voices in Nursing podcast. This is Andrea Schmidt, and I am joined by our co-host, Vicki Good.
Welcome, everyone.
The sudden loss of a loved one is not new, but the impact is no less profound. The loss of a loved one is one of our greatest fears, and as a result, is often left undiscussed. In this podcast, we get Dr. Sue Hassmiller's unique perspective. Sue is a nurse who is not unfamiliar with death, but was caught completely off guard by the very unexpected and tragic loss of her husband, Bob Hassmiller. Sue, welcome to the Voices in Nursing podcast. And before we continue, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your husband, Bob?
Well, I think I would consider myself a nurse's nurse. I started as a nurse's aide, did the clinical route. Very shortly went into public health, have served in many roles at the local, state, and national levels. Spent my career, my latter career at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I have to put in a plug for the American Red Cross. I am immensely involved in the Red Cross and have been since college at many, many, many different levels: frontline disaster responder, policy, advocacy, board member, and let me see. I spent 25 years at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and was responsible for many of the national nursing programs that some may be familiar with: executive nurse leaders, nurse faculty scholars, transforming care at the bedside, and many, many, many others. And it was actually a trip that I put together in 2016 called Following in the Footsteps of Clara Barton, where I was going to be taking about 40 people, and I'm not a travel agent or anything like that, but a real big advocate for the Red Cross and Clara Barton, and I put together this travel trip in the United States and Switzerland. And the day before we were to take off, after a year long of planning, my husband was in a bicycle accident. My husband, Bob Hassmiller, married for 36 years, almost 37, 2 children, just the greatest man you'd ever want to meet in your life. And I'm sure we'll get more into that with the podcast. But that bicycle trip changed my life.
So I know you had talked about, when we were setting up the podcast, how challenging the hospital stay was for you. It sounded like it was incredibly challenging, but you started a blog to keep your friends and family informed of Bob's condition, which eventually became one of your books about the experience, Resetting an Unplanned Journey of Love, Loss, and Living Again. So could you share how you started the blog and how it evolved? Why did you start a blog?
Yeah, I've never done well, that's not true. I'd done a blog professionally. But when my husband was in the bicycle accident, he did not die immediately, but was in the intensive care unit, neurointensive care unit, for 10 days and lived as a quadriplegic for those 10 days. And it was quite brutal, as I'm sure we'll get into. But because I had to pay attention to him 24/7, I had to devote every ounce of my attention to him. I couldn't be calling people. I had a national level job with Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. So word was getting out that this had happened to my husband and myself. And so people began to call, and I couldn't do that. I couldn't be talking to people. So what I thought I would do in real time was start a blog. I began I think the first night or the second day, and I began only sharing what was in my heart and my mind and all of my emotions and everything that was coming out. So I shared the facts, like this is what happened to Bob today, but I shared a lot of details around those facts and in real time what I was going through and what he was going through. And I thought this was informing my family and friends, which it was. But after a few days, people began to get back to me and say how unbelievably helpful this was. And as time went along, 5 days, 6 days, I was writing about everything. And when all was said and done, there were about 2,000 people following me, a lot of people, while I was in the hospital and after. And they said, "Don't stop. We're just hanging on every last word that you're conveying to us." And people were learning. Even after my husband died, I started talking about the grief, what the hospital experience meant to me, what went on, how I was feeling, and then the grief process and how I was living my life. And people were telling me that, oh my gosh, this is so informative. We had no idea that people go through these things in grief. And I was told that the blog was being passed around to pastors and used in health professions education for students and, all kinds of places. So I kept hearing, don't stop, you're teaching us. And so I committed to myself at that point, to answer your question about why the blog, I committed to myself to continuing for 1 year. And I was going to stop at 1 year. And towards, 3/4 of the way through, when people heard that, they said, "Oh, you've got to turn this into a book. This has got to be a book." And so then, after the year, I committed to that, but I didn't jump right into it. I tried to look for publishers. And so that's sort of how the blog went generally, and my process of getting to the point of writing that book.
It sounds like it was a very trying time for you, and I'm very sorry for your loss. You've had a very long and impactful career in nursing, and you had some significant accomplishments through advancing the National Academy of Medicine's recommendations in the Future of Nursing reports. But in your book, you talk about how bizarre you felt in the hospital during this time. And so as a nurse, I can only imagine how different that is to be on the other side. So can you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, and I'll just say one thing in the spirit of love. Nobody can ever know what it's like until you're there. I had no idea. I mean, I've been a nurse for like many decades now, many decades. I found myself saying, I helped so many people die, but I didn't really know that people died until my husband died, because it's just,
Right.
that's the bizarre feeling of it. It's like, what? You're kidding me. People die? I couldn't even fathom that. It was really a rather brutal experience. And I do use that word brutal in the hospital. I fully realize it. And this was a large academic health center. So let's put that context. I never used the name of the facility, but a large academic health center. And we know that in large academic health centers, people want to try things out, right? There are students, there's lots of people who want at interesting cases. So it was just a tremendously brutal ordeal where it seemed that every day that went by was a new attack on my husband's body. Now, you hear me talking as a family member. A nurse would say, there were procedures performed, right? There were tests run.
Right.
But I'm talking to you as a family member. The brutality of the things that were coming at my husband constantly, 24/7, never rest. And it was so unfathomable to me. I think and I described this in the book, and I had not been granted, even though I have served as a nurse in many different ways for many decades and at the leadership level, I had not been in the clinical area for a long time, but I'm not even sure it would have mattered. I don't know. But I describe being in that hospital room with my husband, and every morning they came as a team. And that's how the nurse would say it. But as a family member, I saw a group of intimidators in white coats working on computers, and they only talked to themselves and their computers. And it was very cold, and nobody came into my husband's room. And I found that very bizarre. And so after the first day, I thought, this isn't right. And the whole bizarre part of this hospitalization was that, yes, I was a family member, but I was also a nurse, and I knew how to, quote unquote, behave. I knew not to get hysterical. I knew not to cry, even though crying would have been okay. I knew how to be articulate. I knew how to talk to people. But this is what I did. On the second morning, when I saw the quote unquote intimidators come down the hall, they started again talking to each other, talking to their computers. I pulled up a chair to the side, but as part of their circle, I pulled up a chair and I sat down and I held an 8x10 picture of my husband, just so everyone would know who they were talking about. And people looked at me, but I really wasn't acknowledged. And then probably on the third day or so, the head resident guy, the chief resident, turned to me, maybe on the third or fourth day, and finally asked me, would you like to tell us about your husband? And again, I knew how to behave, and I very carefully and articulately said what I wanted to say about my husband. My husband and I have been married for 36 years. We have 2 beautiful children, 2 grandchildren. I have a 4-month-old. He was the CEO of an educational association. He was a Red Cross hero. He served in many disasters. He was a Vietnam Purple Heart veteran. So I kept it on the short side, pretty much what I said. And after a few minutes, I saw the chief resident with some tears in his eyes.
Mm.
And they weren't going to stop what they were doing, but for just a moment, they knew my husband and the body parts that they were talking about.
Yeah, that's amazing. We just had a recent article in one of our journals about using pictures at the bedside of our patients to bring that compassionate view, in front of, the staff of who is this person that we're taking care of. I love your book.
Can I just interrupt you, Vicki? Can I interrupt you, Vicki,
yeah,
about the pictures?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
because the pictures were very, very important part of my strategy. I knew when I was a practicing nurse in the clinical area, I always made a point of commenting on pictures in the patient's room. So not only did I want my husband to see, but he couldn't really turn his head. Perhaps if we moved him around a little bit, perhaps if I brought the pictures in front of him, yes. But my strategy was to make a connection with staff. I knew that. The first day I was there, I told my daughter exactly which pictures to bring. I want my husband and I, the grandchildren, the children, the dog, his Vietnam picture, very strategically. And there was really just one nurse who paid a great deal of attention to those pictures. And maybe we'll get to that later when I talk about the two nurses who really showed great compassion and what that meant to me. But pictures, very important part of the strategy, Vicki, for me.
Yeah, no, I love that concept, and your book is amazing, and I highly recommend it to folks listening. But I do have to say, as someone that's lost both of my parents, it brought back some of those memories of going through their care. And one thing you talk about in the book, and I think it's kind of a blessing and curse now in healthcare, is we've become a very technology and a data-driven organization. Speak to us about what that impact is on you as a family member versus you as a nurse.
I know full well because, dealing with the policies and the future of nursing reports and all, my job, I know full well, believe me, the value of technology. However, it does not replace the touch. It does not replace someone looking at you. I don't necessarily need, I know there's a thing about nurses sitting and talking, and I think that's fine. But eye contact is so important. Making a connection with pictures, making some kind of connection is so critically important. We're going to accept the technology and we're going to embrace the technology even because we know how far we've come with technology. But please, please don't put it in place of the compassion. I was giving a lecture, maybe I didn't go back to work for quite some time because I was just so grief stricken. I had the air knocked out of me for quite some time. But I remember speaking about my experience and compassion. I think it was at a graduation ceremony. And somebody came up to me after, and I talked about compassion. And a student came up to me afterwards, and she said, "I'm so glad that you spent so much time telling this next generation about compassion. I did my last clinical rotation in the ER. And I wondered about that. And the ER nurse that I was following told me one day, I don't have any time for compassion. I'm a busy ER nurse. And she said, it just didn't sit right with me. And now after hearing you, it really doesn't sit right. But I've heard that people don't have time for compassion. And I don't buy that. Not for a minute. I will never buy that.
Do I really appreciate how much you really humanized your husband for the staff, right? That he's just not a body in the bed. And by putting those pictures up, you realize that he was somebody. And I think that's so important for staff. I think for you, you don't want to be seen as just a visitor there, but an integral part of your husband's care team. And as you know him best. So what do you see as best practices that staff could engage in to maybe make families feel like an integral part of the team?
Yeah, I think, you know what? It is so, I mean, if I was totally intimidated in that intensive care unit, imagine a person who had never set foot in a hospital. Just imagine going through the grief and the shock of that accident. What I really felt bad about, not only my own situation and what was going and the intimidators, the do-gooders, who were coming down the hall. But I was so cognizant of my special, unique place in the world as a nurse and sitting in that circle and knowing how to behave and knowing what to say. The families in the waiting room were crying and eating Doritos and watching TV. And of course, I really wasn't talking to them. I didn't know their exact circumstances, but I just felt so terrible for them because I didn't see them coming into the rooms. I didn't see them, and maybe they were taking turns. I didn't see them talking to their providers, although I'm sure there were times when they did. But I just felt for the people who weren't in the know as I was. So just very, very important, make a connection. Make a connection with the families as much as you can. Just assume that they're traumatized. Just assume that they're intimidated. And just, a touch, look in the eye, sit down with them, do whatever you can to not be in a hurry and let them know that you are there with them and you're going to do everything you can to help your loved one.
Sue, you make an incredibly great point there. And, one thing that I remember from when I was doing my training to be a critical care nurse in my residency, one of my instructors said, always assume that your patient and your family is having the worst day of their life and approach them from that perspective. Number one, with caring and compassion, before any of the technology comes to play. And that always has resonated with me. And I know there was a couple of nurses that you spoke about that really brought forward that caring and compassion. So I would love to hear their story and how you've stayed in touch with them through the years.
Oh my God, my Abby and my Kathy. My Abby and my Kathy. Abby was in the first intensive care unit, and she was a nurse anesthetist, and my husband was transferred out of that hospital into a more of a specialty care hospital, if you will, an academic health center after the second day. But Abby, and I was in complete shock, she just took my hand and said, your husband was amazing. Was he ever in the military? Because he stayed so calm. She just tried to make a connection about my husband and how special he was, even though she didn't know him. And then I'll never forget, I looked at her name tag and I said, Abby, that's the name of my granddaughter. And we just made a little bit of a connection there. And she said, when was the last time you ate? And I didn't remember. She says, I'm going to go down. I'm going to get you a snack right now, if that's okay. So she ran down. She probably took 30 minutes out of her day. That's a long time. That is a long time, granted. But she stayed in touch with me afterwards. And she said she probably went against her institution's protocol by reaching out to me by email. And she found out about my blog, and she started reading it, and she contacted me, and she said it was really one of the most meaningful parts of her life as an ICU nurse and a nurse anesthetist, to hear exactly what a person was going through at every moment. It just really meant the world to her, and it taught her. Kathy. Now let me tell you about Kathy. Kathy was in the academic health center. And really, although the nurses were good and they were fine, this is what I would say. This is Sue, the family member, talking, not the nurse. There are a lot of good nurses in this country, but you're never going to be a great nurse, in my mind, as a family member, unless you have that compassion factor going for you as well. So what did Kathy do to show me her compassion? She came in, and she made a point of looking at those pictures and pointing out, oh, it looks like you really enjoyed traveling. Tell me where you've been. She was the only one who really took note of the fact that my husband only had feeling from his chin up. And so she touched, every time she came in, she touched my husband's forehead. And she talked to him as if he was okay, you know what I mean, and always talked to me. Now, she didn't stay long, but her body language of not being in a hurry, her body language of eye contact, pointing out the pictures, saying, I saw you in that circle. Good for you, girl. I saw you in that intimidator circle. Good for you, girl. And she just kind of stayed with me and informed me when I needed to be informed. She had her other patients. Then it was getting towards the end. And I asked the hospital, she wasn't there one day, and I asked the nurse there, is there some kind of an ethics committee? Because there was just so much being done to my husband. He kept going downhill every day, and I knew he didn't want to live this way. And they said, what do you mean, palliative care? And I said, yes, palliative care. Do you have a palliative care committee? So I talked to the palliative care committee. We decided that the next day we were going to turn off my husband's machines. And thank goodness Kathy was going to be there that day. She stayed with me the whole day. She explained the whole procedure to me. She knew I was a nurse, but she knew I hadn't been a clinical. She treated me as a family member and a part-time nurse as well. So my husband kept going on and going on. She says, I think your husband must have been an athlete, riding that bike all the time. He's just not giving in. You may want to tell him in his ear it's okay to go. So she talked to me. She talked to my husband. And then the scariest part of all, and this is what made me such a fan in Kathy's book, it was getting to be the end of the shift. And my husband was not close to stopping, to dying. Okay. And so she came in and she said, it's time for me to go. She had her coat on. She had her purse wrapped around her chest. And I just looked at her and I said, Kathy, I don't know if I can do this without you. And she ripped off her coat, threw off her purse. She said, I am not leaving you. I am not leaving you. And she stayed with me for the next 2 hours. I guess she had to get approval. I have no idea. But she stayed with me, and I will never forget her ever in my whole life.
Dude, that is such an amazing story of compassion from those two nurses. Do you have any thoughts about how leadership can help create a healthy work environment in which mindfully compassionate care can occur and we can have more Kathys?
I do think culture starts at the top. I mean, you can have a person, not everyone has the ultimate compassion that Kathy may have had. Maybe she grew up that way, right? Maybe that's the person she was. But I think as a leader, you can and you must set the culture for compassion. Because if it starts at the top, it trickles down to the managers. If it's a priority, it has to be a priority. And then there has to be role modeling. I mean, I know that CNOs do rounds and managers do rounds, role modeling this behavior. And this is what I know too. In terms of compassion, we know there's a lot of research around this compassion cycle, if you will. There's a nurse by the name of Christina Dempsey. She wrote a book called, what is it called, Vicki?
It's The Antidote to Suffering.
The Antidote to Suffering, a wonderful book. And in this book, she talks about this compassion cycle. And this is when a nurse, or anybody really, but I'll put a nurse in this scenario, provides compassion, eye contact, a touch, talking of pictures, anything to convey compassion. And the person, the human being at the other end of that feels it. And when they feel it, they reciprocate back to the nurse. And when that nurse gets that reciprocation back, like I know I gave reciprocation back to Abby and Kathy, then the cycle is such that they want to do that again. It's Pavlovian, right? It's Pavlovian. The cycle goes on and on. So I get sort of really upset these days with all the burnout and everything. And it's dreadful, really, for our profession. And I really don't want nurses to feel so burnt out that they can't give to the patients because, as I so often say, you can't give what you don't have. But if you can give a little bit of compassion, that will come back to you, that will feed you. And I really believe that's a part, certainly not the whole picture, but a small part, if you will, of nurse well-being.
Absolutely. And Christina and I have talked multiple times about that. And she was a nurse who went through similar situation with her son-in-law, who was a police officer that was shot in the head. He made a great recovery. And then Christina's also fought breast cancer herself. But, your journey has been incredible, Sue. And I just want to thank you for sharing it with us. And it's really taught you to live and love again.
Yeah.
And it's a journey of hope for others. So what is your life like now? I know you're still an active contributor to the nursing profession.
Yeah. So the miracle of my life, I would say that blog was so helpful to write. It was cathartic. And I never meant to help so many people, if you will, in the book. I never, nothing was ever for money, of course. Everything was just catharsis in the beginning and then help later.
Right.
And amazingly, one of the people who was reading that blog, because I told you thousands were reading it, was a man who used to be my boss at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And 3 years after I lost my husband, I get a call one early Sunday morning from a colleague of mine at United Health. I was on a board at the time there, and said, Sue, you're the only person we know who's lost a spouse suddenly, and we need your help because somebody we work with lost their spouse, and we just don't know how to talk to him. And by the way, you know him. And it was my former boss, Lou Sandy. So I reached out to him immediately. I didn't have to explain why I was reaching out because I knew he was a blog reader. And after a year of quote unquote friendship and colleagueship and spiritual connections, at the end of that year, I fell for him hard. And eventually he fell for me. We never told each other because I was trying to be so protective of his own grief process, right? But at the end of that year, I give him all the credit. He's the one who, like a middle schooler, said, Sue, I think I might be, I don't, is there any chance? Like we were a couple of preschoolers. But when it all came out, I said, oh my God, I feel the same way. And the rest is history. And both losing a spouse brought us together, and he's a physician, so we love to jointly talk about the compassion factor.
That's amazing and so wonderful that you were able to find love again. And I know it doesn't diminish your love for Bob any bit whatsoever.
That's right. That's right.
Sue, I want to say thank you so much for sharing your deeply personal and inspiring story with us and our listeners. I'm excited to see where you take this journey next, and very happy that you found love again.
I cannot tell you how meaningful this was for me to be able to share this story with my colleagues about my husband and everything that I went through and what I hope to convey. So thank you so much for asking me. It meant the world to me.
You are so welcome.
Thank you as well to our listeners. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast using your favorite streaming platform. We would also love to hear your feedback on this episode and your ideas for future episodes. Please send us your thoughts to podcasts@aacn.org.
Thank you for listening to the American Association of Critical Care Nurses Voices in Nursing podcast, proudly sponsored by AACN's Beacon Award for Excellence, offering unit-level recognition for exceptional units, with information available at www.aacn.org/unit recognition.